2014 is called Trust, A History with Oxford University Press. One of many of his books. He was a Reith lecturer in 1988. He's a fellow of the British Academy. He was given and awarded an OBE very recently in 2015. Now, we're on a tight schedule today, unfortunately. We have to give the room back in 1 hour's time. So Professor Hosking will talk for 45 minutes or so, and then we'll have short questions, and then longer questions for those who would like to join us for a drink in South Cloisters afterwards. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Hosking.
Thank you very much. Well, relations today between Russia and the West are as bad as I can remember them. In fact, they're very bad, and that is extremely dangerous. There's also a good deal of moralizing going on both sides. Both the West, on the whole, and Russia are keen to condemn the other side as immoral, dangerous, fanatical, and so on. I want to suggest today that Russia and the West both have responsibility for the growth of this crisis. I'm not going to talk about the crisis itself, but I'm going to look at the background, how things have changed since 1991. Because if you remember, those of you who can remember back now nearly 25 years, there was a very high level of trust between Western and Soviet, then Russian leaders at that time. The new Russia began with every intention of transforming itself into a full participating member of the international institutions which had been set up in 1945 to keep the peace. Yeltsin told the US Congress that Russia wished to, I quote, join the world community. And he said, Russia sees the West and the countries of the East not merely as partners but as allies. This is a highly important prerequisite for peaceful cooperation amongst the states of the civilized world. Our principles are simple and understandable. The supremacy of democracy, human rights and liberties, legality and morality. That was President Yeltsin in 1992. And so Russia finally abandoned Marxism, the priority of class struggle, abandoned any claim to dominate Eastern and Central Europe. It accepted a unified Germany within NATO. It removed its troops, not only from the former Warsaw Pact countries, but also from the former Soviet Baltic republics. This was a very considerable concession, and we tend to forget that now. The agreements made around the time of the fall of the Soviet Union were kept by Russia. Apparently, on the understanding that NATO would not expand further to the east, beyond East Germany, which had already been agreed. I'll come back to that just a little bit later. And of course, Russia carried out a far-reaching democratization of its political system, including full elections, indeed for the president himself. The Russian Foreign Office was ready to play its full part in this ambitious program of rapprochement with the West and with international institutions. The first draft of its basic doctrine emphasized the role of the Conference for Security and Cooperation in Europe and stated that Russia would defend its interests first and foremost through participation in various international organizations. In the immediate aftermath of the dissolution of the USSR, Russia was incorporated into a number of international institutions. The G7 economic summits were turned into the G8, and Russia was admitted to the Council of Europe, which is the body concerned with rights, human rights, and civil society throughout Europe. So things looked very promising in the early 1990s. But of course, at the same time, the fall of the Soviet Union created new problems for Russia itself, some of which proved to be serious obstacles on the road to a trusting relationship with the West. The first problem was that Russia suddenly found itself surrounded by independent ex-Soviet republics, not all of whom were friendly. It thus had a new and potentially threatening security problem on its borders, exacerbated by the fact that more than 20 million ethnic Russians lived in other ex-Soviet republics, and some of them faced hostile discrimination from their new leaders. There was a flood of refugees into Russia in the early 1990s, which Russia itself found very difficult to cope with at a time when its economy was at a low ebb. All the same, the first Russian foreign minister, Andrei Kozyrev, did his best to work with international institutions in solving some of these problems. Russia, after all, had very legitimate security interests in stability and a possible prosperity of the neighbouring republics. But the aims of the Foreign Office were not aimed, I think it's fair to say, by the Russian Ministry of Defence, or indeed by the Russian army. So that in 1992 and 93, Russian military units actually supported Abkhaz separatist rebels in breaking away, or trying to break away, from Georgia. In fact, the Georgian leader Shevardnadze at one point exclaimed in exasperation and despair that the evil empire was at work again, by which he meant Russia was a kind of neo-Soviet Union imposing its will on its neighbours. So serious problems arose right from the start. Now, Kozyrev did try to get international observers involved in keeping the peace in Abkhazia. He joined with Shevardnadze, in fact, and with UN General Secretary Boutros Ghali in calling for UN and CSCE monitors to supervise a peace agreement there. But international institutions were very slow to respond. 2 months later, this was, let me see, September 1993, the agreement broke down. The UN had sent only 5 of the 88 observers it had promised. As someone quipped at the time, there were more CNN cameramen there than UN observers. In his memoirs, looking back on this period, Kozyrev comments, probably rightly, that the Western powers were suspicious of Russian peacekeepers, regarding them as potentially neo-imperialist, in other words, using the pretext of peacekeeping to reimpose Russian domination. I would have thought that was an argument for sending more peacekeepers and taking the thing really seriously, but for whatever reason, Western powers did not do this. And of course, this was around the time that the US gave up peacekeeping in Somalia and withdrew from there. Well, Russia, of course, could not simply withdraw from Abkhazia because it's a neighbouring country. But without support from the West, of course, it was really a self-fulfilling prophecy that Russian troops would turn into neo-imperialist forces. Kozyrev concludes resignedly in his memoirs, evidently, our country was fated to play a special role in maintaining peace and stability in the former USSR, especially since no state in the near or distant abroad and no international organisation had either the will or the capacity to replace Russia as a peacekeeping force in that region. In our present mood, we would regard that as hypocrisy, but I think that was a genuine statement of feeling at the time. There was, in other words, a very strong problem of mutual distrust left over from the Cold War, and early efforts to break those down between Russia and the neighbouring republics didn't succeed. The strain of maintaining an international stance was so great that at a meeting of foreign ministers in Stockholm, Kozyrev made an extraordinary spoof speech announcing that Russia would no longer pursue the goal of freedom and democracy, but would give priority to defending its own great power interests, and he called on the former Soviet republics to band together under Russian leadership. Foreign ministers gathered in Stockholm had no idea that he wasn't serious, and they were horrified. This sudden 180-degree change in Russian foreign policy. Well, after he finished his speech, Kozyrev poured oil on troubled waters by telling them that it was indeed a spoof, but if they didn't watch it, this would become Russian foreign policy in the not too distant future. And of course, here we are 22 years later, and one can say it pretty well is Russian foreign policy. So, there we are. Russia's government was itself divided. The situation on Russia's borders was difficult. The West was not prepared to get fully involved. There was, in fact, a radical divide inside Russian opinion forming, and this divide, this serious division, was reflected, of course, in the Russian media and in the Russian press, which in the 1990s was pretty free. And many people in Russia, of course, were very worried by the collapse of the Soviet Union, the collapse of the wall to power. We, of course, saw this as a hopeful developments, but many people in the Soviet Union, especially Russians, regarded it with alarm and resentment. And some of this alarm and resentment, I think, was evident in the Chechen crisis in 1994, when President Yeltsin decided to send in troops in a very heavy-handed and disproportionate response to the challenge of the Chechen Declaration of Independence. 40,000 Russian troops invaded in December 1994. They bombarded the capital, Grozny, which was full of civilians at the time. There was tremendous loss of life. This rightly worried many people in the West. It was an absurd, grotesquely disproportionate show of force by Russia. And yet, in spite of Russia's superiority in numbers and weapons, its troops never succeeded in dominating Chechen territory, and after 18 months had to conclude a humiliating peace, which left Chechnya, in effect, an independent state, one which, moreover, began to turn itself into an Islamic republic. So that was another humiliation for Russia, and one which left Russians again feeling bewildered and resentful. Well, I turn now to economics, which was yet another major set of problems in the relations between Russia and the West. During and after the Soviet collapse, Gorbachev and then Yeltsin appealed for financial aid from the West for the program of reconstruction, privatization, liberalization, and so on, which they were planning. The West, by and large, did not offer it. President Bush Sr. Came to power at about that time and was reluctant to provide serious economic aid. Probably it would have been most useful in the form of a stabilization fund, that's to say, setting up a large fund which Russia could call upon if its currency was threatened. In the absence of a stabilization fund, there was hyperinflation over the next 2 or 3 years, one which deprived better off Russians of most of their savings. You can, in a way, understand Bush's approach. He was reluctant to provide aid because he thought, not unreasonably, that much of it would disappear into the hands of corrupt officials and corrupt businessmen. But it was, I think, a short-sighted approach, because the mere gesture would have been very helpful to Russian leaders and might have restrained the growth into hyperinflation. After all, a stabilization fund may not need to be called on at all. The very fact that it's there can help to stabilize a currency. Clinton took a different approach when he became president. He regarded helping Russia to achieve democracy and prosperity as a major priority, and Clinton put in a lot of work in developing good personal relationships with Yeltsin, on the principle that the best way to build up trust, or the best way to start building trust between different nations, is to have good personal relations between leaders. And he put a lot of time and effort into that, and so did his leading advisor. He was accused at the time, and later, of having allowed this good personal relationship to over-influence him. For example, when Yeltsin invaded Chechnya, he was not very vigorously criticized in the West. But Clinton persisted because he believed that Yeltsin was the only Russian politician on the scene who combined real power with commitment to democracy. At one stage, he even compared Yeltsin with Abraham Lincoln. Yeltsin fighting to integrate Chechnya into Russia just as Abraham Lincoln had declared war on the secessionist South to keep the United States in being. I have to say that many of Clinton's own advisors were appalled by this parallel. And in the middle of the crisis, precipitated by Yeltsin's dissolution of the his armed, violent dissolution of the Supreme Soviet in 1993, Clinton overcame his own doubts and those of his advisors. We're in this thing for keeps, he said. Yeltsin's hanging in there and we've got to stick with him. When he's got hard calls to make, he's more likely to make the right ones with the knowledge that I'm there for him. So there you are. There's a very strong personalization of the relationship. And Clinton's advisors and aides also created strong trust relationships with certain Russian actors. US economic consultants worked through a narrow team of reformers around the privatization supremo Anatoly Chubais, whom they knew well and trusted. Most of their information about the state of the Russian economy came to them through that team. They never consulted politicians from a wider public, let alone from the opposition. Western consultants worked in many Russian economic ministries. They were usually in a hurry, having annual budgets to justify, and they tended to couch their recommendations almost in the form of commands, which was humiliating to a country accustomed to thinking of itself as a great power. So, this is the normal downside of trust, is cliquish exclusiveness, and I think that's what happened in the relationship between top US consultants and their Russian counterparts. Little was done to reinforce Russian citizens' trust in institutions. Yet institutions were vital if politics was to become less hung up on personal and tribal feuds within the government. Another problem was that Clinton and his advisors considered it self-evident that economic institutions which worked well in the West, at least we thought at that time they worked well in the West, would also work well in Russia, with just a bit of advice and help. One of Clinton's emissaries told Russian Prime Minister Chernomyrdy that the conditions on which the IMF disbursed funds to Russia contained harsh conditions because they reflected the laws of economics, which were like those of physics, and you had to obey those laws. Chernomyrdy retorted that his government, I quote, had to conduct economic policy within the bounds of what was tolerable to the Parliament and the electorate. So there wasn't much meeting of minds there. The institutions through which economic aid passed to Russia, the AID, the IMF, were actually accustomed to dealing with countries that had very different problems from Russia. Underdevelopment, not distorted development. And, as I said before, they had an agenda that was rushed and which concentrated on certain limited aims conceived for different circumstances. The familiar ones: privatization, deregulation, cutting state expenditure. They did not make any attempt, really, to conserve what social capital Russia had accumulated inside the USSR. The Soviet economy didn't work particularly well, but it nevertheless created a lot of functioning institutions which were incapable of coping with international competition. And the international institutions gave insufficient attention to the social consequences of radical economic reform. This was something they did not only in Russia, but in other countries, Indonesia, Thailand, etc., in the 1990s. They did nothing to put an economic safety net in place or to conserve functioning, at a modest level, functioning health and education services. And as a result, during the 1990s, there was a drastic decline in Russians' health, particularly those of men. There was a remarkable fall in male life expectancy during the 1990s. And of course, being less healthy and less well educated was not good for Russia's economy. Not to mention the human distress caused. So this degradation of social and economic life as a result of Western and international policies generated among the Russian population great resentment and strong distrust of the West and of international institutions. And of course, the Western economic advice imposed at such cost also failed, quite simply. Through privatization, much of it at knockdown prices, the Russian state deprived itself of a hefty proportion of its revenues, and its revamped taxation systems were simply incapable of making up the shortfall. The finance ministry and the central bank tried various devices for covering the deficit. They printed money, which caused runaway inflation. Then they simply stopped paying those dependent on the state for their incomes, so that pensioners, school teachers, doctors would be paid either not at all or very late in inflated rubles. The Russian state also began borrowing money from the IMF and the World Bank through short-term bonds at high interest rates. None of this was sustainable in the long term, and in August 1998, the charade came to an inglorious end. The government declared that Russia was defaulting on its debts. Overnight, most of Moscow's banks became technically insolvent, and for the second time in the 1990s, savers lost a lot of their money. Real wages fell by 40%, the ruble lost 2/3 of its value, and the proportion of the population living below the official poverty line rose from 20% to 35%. Well, at this stage, even doggedly pro-Western reformers now turned against Western advice. Deputy Finance Minister Kasyanov told Strobe Talbot, one of Clinton's principal advisors, "We're not here to take exams or listen to lectures. If our Western partners had all the solutions to our problems, we wouldn't be in this mess now, given how hard earlier Russian governments worked to do what you people told us to do." Well, in actual fact, August 1998 was probably a blessing in disguise. It was, in fact, marked the beginning of the upturn in the Russian economy, which turned out to function better when not burdened by Western advice from free marketeers. Right, let's now look at the question of NATO and Russia. When the Cold War came to an end, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, former Warsaw Pact members, were all, naturally, very concerned about the possibility of a revival of Russian aggression, even though that couldn't be foreseen at the time. Their experience of domination by the Soviet Union during the Cold War had been so harsh that they were determined to do everything possible to prevent the revival of Russia. And during the 1990s, NATO expanded further to the east to assuage these Cold War ghosts. The Western powers, in other words, took a conscious decision to rate the security of Poland and other Central European countries, eventually up to and including the Baltic republics, to rate their security higher than reassuring Russia. Russians recalled, and specifically Gorbachev recalled that Genscher, German Foreign Minister, and Baker, US Secretary of State, had given undertakings in 1990 that NATO, having absorbed the GDR, would not move any nearer the Soviet-Russian frontier. But, as far as I can see, those undertakings were not incorporated into any written agreement, and the West chose to override them. This is a grievance which still festers with the Russians, and Putin mentions it from time to time. So the Russians felt not only threatened, but betrayed, since on that understanding they had withdrawn their own troops from the very countries now joining NATO. Yeltsin and initially Putin felt obliged to accept NATO enlargement because they couldn't prevent it, but it cast another shadow of distrust over Russia-NATO relationships. Now there was, at the same time, was set up a partnership for peace, which included Russia and the other former Warsaw Pact countries. Initially, it was set up to mediate in discussions about security and military problems, international criminality and so on, between Russia, Central Europe and the West. But during the following 10 years, most of those countries, except Russia, did join NATO, so that was then replaced by a NATO-Russian Council in 2002, again to try and ensure that NATO and Russia could consult about common problems. NATO felt that it was acting responsibly in expanding to the east, partly to assuage the fears of Central European nations, as I say, but partly also because those nations, if they were not drawn into an international security organization, would be, or might become, what we could call loose cannons, that's to say, not really answerable to anybody. But the NATO-Russia Council functioned after a fashion, and in fact, quite a lot of Western military advisors went to Russia to teach them about things like reacting to environmental disasters and so on. So there was some useful work done, but the basic suspicion, I think, was never really overcome. And furthermore, gradually, as we shall see, the organisation became moribund. The relations between Russia and the West sharpened again during the Kosovo Crisis in 1999. This was sparked off by the persistent Serb campaigns of ethnic cleansing in former Yugoslavia, climaxing with the Račak massacre of January 1999. After failing to persuade Milosevic to stop these campaigns, NATO forces began bombing Serbian targets. Now, as I understand it, there was no proper discussion of this in Partnership for Peace, and certainly the NATO campaign was not authorized by the United Nations, because it had, I mean, in the Security Council, Russia would certainly have vetoed it, that's why it wasn't. But the West, of course, regarded this bombing campaign as an enlightened effort to prevent gross violations of human rights. But it's fair to say, I think, that most Russians regarded it as a crude assertion of Western, and especially US, military might against a country which was a traditional client of Russia. And some Russians actually regarded it as a trial run for a possible attack on Russia itself. Yeltsin himself, still president at this time, was caught between those two views. He hated to see Russia ignored and humiliated, and his first reaction was to berate Clinton for having let him down. But he wanted to continue cultivating good relationships with the West, and personally with his good friend Bill. He tried to persuade Milosevic to back down, but failed. He seems to have decided in the end that Russia should help negotiate an end to the war, and if possible, gain what it could from the settlement. As an envoy, he chose former Prime Minister Viktor Chernomyrdin, who enjoyed close personal relationships with US Vice President Al Gore. And in the end, Chernomyrdic was able to persuade Milosevic that Russia could and would not help him, that he must therefore accept Western demands. So once again, Russia made a major effort here to pacify the situation, and on the whole, in the way that the West wanted. But Russian troops were not allocated a specific occupation area within Serbia, and within Kosovo, I'm sorry. And that was really unacceptable to the Russian army. So there was, in fact, a dramatic confrontation between Russian troops and Western troops. Even during the vital negotiations, General Ivashov from the Russian Defense Ministry refused to sign the agreement on the occupation of Kosovo. And on the 11th of June, as the Serbian withdrawal from Kosovo was underway, but before NATO had entered it, some 200 Russian paratroopers from Bosnia moved through Serbia with the apparent compliance of the Serbian authorities and took up position at the Pristina airport, let's say the capital of Kosovo. What they apparently intended to do was to prepare the way for several thousand more Russian troops to be airlifted from Russia and perhaps establish a Russian occupation sector in Kosovo. General Wesley Clark, commander of the NATO forces, ordered General Mike Jackson to block the airport runway in order to prevent this happening. Well, obviously, if Mike Jackson had attempted to enter the airport with armed force, the Russians would have resisted. Mike Jackson is claimed later to have said, "I am not going to start World War III." And he refused to obey that order and asserted his right to refer the matter upwards to politicians for a decision. Well, in the end, there was no forceful occupation of Pristina airport, no driving out of Russian troops. What happened was that it was simply blockaded. Russian troops couldn't be fed, and in the end had to withdraw peacefully. Yeltsin later told Clinton that their relationship had come near to collapse at that point. But, said Yeltsin, even at the toughest moment we asked ourselves, should we keep working together? And we always answered, yes. The colour revolutions. First of all, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine in the autumn of 2004 brought out unambiguously the clash between two different views of civil society and political opposition. Yanukovych claimed to have won the election, though it had obviously been rigged, as international organizations reported, and mass demonstrations in Kiev and other cities forced a rerun of the election. And the coming to power of Yushchenko, who was a pro-Western candidate. Most Western statesmen regarded the result as a triumph for democratic politics. The Russian government, however, and many Russian citizens regarded it as yet another crude assertion of Western great power politics. And moreover, a deadly serious one. Because for most Russians, Ukraine is really part of Russia, part of their own country, and the thought that it might join together with the West are deeply troubling them. Now, there had been already another colour revolution, the so-called Rose Revolution in Georgia, which brought to power Mikhail Saakashvili, another pro-Western politician. And he and his colleagues set about a rapid westernization of their country, aimed at ousting the remaining Russian influence. They had strong EU and US support. Indeed, George W. Bush visited Tbilisi in May 2005. The US military helped to retrain and re-equip the Georgian army. And then, in April 2008, the NATO summit in Bucharest took preliminary steps to integrate both Ukraine and Georgia into NATO. The summit stated that it welcomed, I quote, Ukraine's and Georgia's Euro-Atlantic aspirations for membership in NATO. We agree today that those countries will become NATO members. Now, strangely, in view of that, Ukraine and Georgia were specifically denied the so-called Membership Action Plan, which would have been the normal next stage to integrating country into NATO. It would have laid down a procedure and a timetable for their eventual integration. So in this way, in 2008, NATO took a step which was bound to be seen as a threat to Russia, and was perceived in that way by most Russians, but then showed indecision in following it up, or uncertainty in following it up, which of course is precisely the wrong way to handle a great power. Now, as it happens, in the 2000s, Russia and the United States were still working together quite closely against the danger of Islam, against drug trading and so on. So despite of the level of suspicion between Russia and the West, cooperation was still possible and was in fact achieved. But the Georgian campaign to become a member of NATO, and then also to reintegrate Abkhazia and southern Ossetia fully into Georgia, did arouse alarm in Moscow. It was now that the West's lethargy, or inattention, in contributing to peacekeeping in Abkhazia in 1992 finally produced its damaging effects. By this time, for about 15 years, Abkhazia had been a territory of uncertain status, though increasingly dominated by Russia. Native Abkhaz had actually long wanted to break away from Georgia. This went right back to the 1920s, in fact, when they wanted to become part of the Russian Republic of the Soviet Union, but were required to join Georgia. And Russia, of course, exploited this situation and actually granted Russian citizenship to many Abkhaz people. Now, with Saakashvili trying to reintegrate Abkhazia into Georgia, Russians claimed the right to defend their citizens against, quote, Georgian aggression. Saakashvili reacted to this threat, first of all by moving into southern Ossetia, closing down markets and smuggling networks which were under Russian influence. Some Ossetians resisted this process violently, possibly trained in Russia itself. On the 7th of August 2008, Georgia tried to re-establish military control in Tskhinvali, the South Ossetian capital. Russia responded immediately by sending in the 58th Army and airborne troops, while bombing targets in Georgia itself. Russia claimed that the purpose of this operation was peace enforcement. Peace enforcement, not peacekeeping. Russian troops temporarily occupied Georgian territory, while Ossetians shelled ethnically Georgian villages, driving the inhabitants out. Now, eventually, under a ceasefire agreement negotiated by President Sarkozy of France, Russians withdrew from Georgia proper, but they remained in Abkhazia and southern Ossetia, Russian troops. Russia didn't annex those territories directly, but declared them independent states. A status acknowledged, I believe, only by Nicaragua and Venezuela amongst the world powers. So those two territories have remained in kind of limbo ever since. Tension between Russia and the West got worse when the EU announced its Eastern Partnership Programme. Now, this was aimed at Georgia, Ukraine, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Belarus, and Moldova. The Eastern Partnership Programme was intended to provide a forum for discussing free trade deals and mutual economic arrangements between the European Union and those countries, with the aim of moving towards eventual membership of the European Union, although that aim was certainly not stressed at the time. It was clearly latent, though, in the background. Russia regarded this partnership with considerable suspicion. It viewed the European Union insistence on human rights and the rule of law as hypocritical, as a hypocritical neo-imperialist ideology. Hypocritical because Russians living in Latvia and Estonia did not enjoy full civil rights unless they had mastered the Latvian or Estonian languages. So, altogether, by 2008, we were becoming aware of a basic misfit between Russia and the Western powers. In fact, on our whole outlook on international affairs, Russians, not just their government, had come to view international institutions with profound distrust, as having deceived them in both economic and diplomatic spheres. Russia returned to a familiar imperial Russian and Soviet diplomatic and military posture, really animated by a different view of the nature of international relations from Western powers. Most attempts to work through international institutions really were abandoned by Russia at this stage. And I would say that its view of international relations was roughly what I would call 18th century mercantilist. That is to say, great powers jostle with one another, they compete with one another for power and resources. And in this situation, under this view, one side's gain is always the other side's loss. Win-win situations are not envisaged. Everything is a zero-sum game. The contrast was dramatized in 2009 when Polish Foreign Minister Radek Sikorski unexpectedly suggested inviting Russia to join NATO. I don't know about the background to that, actually. It's an intriguing suggestion, and it was almost immediately dropped. Russia expressing no interest whatever now in joining NATO. And the Russian envoy to NATO, Dmitry Rogozin, commented, "Great powers do not join alliances, they create alliances." Russia considers itself a great power. Well, that's where Russia is now, quite clearly. So, under this view of international relations, the state has the right to mobilize all the resources of society, and we can see that happening in Russia right now. The economy, information, the media, science and technology, they're all viewed as belonging to the state, even if they're in private hands. Nevertheless, the state has the right to control them and deploy them in international relations. Non-government organizations have to be corralled together under the government's authority, otherwise they're not allowed to function, as we have seen in recent years. This is what Putin means when he talks of sovereign democracy. Many Russians, not only Putin, have come to the conclusion from 20 years of post-Cold War international politics that Russia cannot rely on international institutions but must stand on its own feet and assert its interests as a great power. Russia has legitimate interests in the security of its neighbouring states and in their economic ties with Russia. But it acts on that conviction by defending its interests in an overbearing and neo-imperial manner. And it's very difficult, really, given the behaviour of Russians in foreign policy, to look behind it and say, well, yes, Russia does have legitimate interests there. They're trying to enforce those interests in an unacceptable way, but they do have real interests. For example, in at least a friendly Ukraine. Now, the West doesn't have to accept the terms of Russia's argument, but it must at least try to understand what they are if trust is to be slowly and painfully restored. During the last few months, we've seen a really massive campaign, both by governments and by the media in the West, to attack Russia really in black and white terms. The West is doing everything right, Russia is doing everything wrong. It's much more complicated than that, as I hope I've shown. Russia and NATO can work together. They work together in dealing with Afghanistan. They work together in dealing with terrorism. And even as the Ukrainian crisis was gathering steam in 2014, Russia and NATO were working together in removing chemical weapons from Syria. So, when Russia and the West, or Russia and NATO, have common interests, they can work together even in very difficult circumstances. And I think we need to think about this right now, because relations between Russia and the West are worse than I've ever known, and it's extremely dangerous. Ukraine has already been through a war in which more than 5,000 people have been killed and hundreds of thousands of people have been displaced from their homes. It's a very destructive war. It's a major war. We can't let this situation go on. Of course, Russia has to play its part. But we have to, I think, understand more than we've done so far why it is that Russia is worried by developments in Ukraine. I'm not talking about the Ukrainian crisis here in detail, because other people know more about that, and we're all thinking about it anyway. I'm trying to give the background, I'm trying to suggest that there are ways in which we can still try to work together. And we should also try and create conditions in which common work becomes possible. I think it would be an excellent thing, for example, if the Latvian and Estonian governments now worked hard to give full civil rights to all its citizens, including those whose native language is Russian. Because if Russia does indeed want to expand further and cause trouble in the Baltic, that's an obvious way in which they can go about it, by exploiting the grievances of Russians living in Latvia and Estonia. So, we're now in the middle of a rather doubtful ceasefire. Obviously, I hope in Ukraine, I hope that it will stick. And I hope that conditions can be created, because I believe that in spite of everything, Russia and the West can work together. They do have common interests still.